Hey there, beloved evergreen history and motion picture students. We are back. You've got some important notes that you need to take with these videos this week, so take a moment to get out some paper. And we are still in the silent era. We're going to be spending 4 class sessions, the next 4 class sessions in the silent era. And 3 of those 4 sessions we are looking at silent comedy, along with other things that I'll be posting in between to keep up with things. So let's just talk about comedy in general. Now, comedy has a universal appeal, and we obviously enjoy comedy very much, more so than, I should say it's more universal than other genres. And there's a reason for that. When we think about it psychologically, the idea of comedy has to do with pain. Okay, that's really what comedy comes down to. Comedy is about pain and human fragmentation. I think that's a good phrase to be aware of. Human fragmentation, our fallenness, our fallen nature. And basically what comedy does is it, number one, reminds us of this fragmentation, the fact that it celebrates our imperfection, our fallenness, okay? And we enjoy that. We enjoy that because it helps to remind us as the audience member that we're not alone in this fragmentation, that we all share in this fragmentation. We all share in this fallenness. And when we laugh, it's because we're recognizing ourselves in the character. Even if the situation that the character is going through doesn't quite match the details of our life, we can relate to that on a primal level. Now, what's important for people performing comedy is to understand that it's very, very difficult to do this right, very difficult to do it well. You can't play it for laughs. Okay, you can't be laughing and smirking and trying to quote unquote be funny. The reason it's funny is because it's real and serious to the character. And again, this is why comedy is actually very, very difficult to do well for performers. Because you need to do it in a way that seems real and serious, like you're really experiencing that pain. If that character is really experiencing that nervousness of getting up in front of a public audience to give a speech, they can't be smirking and playing it halfway. It's got to be real. If that young man is trying so hard to let that young lady know that he's in love with her and asks her to marry him, that's got to be a real struggle for him. Okay, if that guy is frustrated with his car breaking down all the time and he keeps having to get out and replace this while the other part of the car is falling apart, he's got to play it like he's really frustrated. And it's a very fine line to play. It's a very, very fine line to play, because if you play it too much, then it becomes melodrama. It becomes a very different kind of tone. So doing it well is a very hard thing to do. And so I hope that you appreciate all of this as we look at a few pioneers of silent comedy who still influence and entertain today. So our first pioneer we're going to be looking at is this gentleman. Normally, most people would not recognize him in this way, but we clearly recognize him when he's in costume, in wardrobe, as not only his most famous character, but perhaps the most famous icon in movie history. So this is Charles Chaplin, or sometimes known as Charlie Chaplin, and this character that he created is referred to as the Tramp, or the Little Tramp. For more than 90 years, 90 plus years, Chaplin with the Little Tramp, he's arguably the most universally recognized film celebrity. There's probably no other icon or symbol that so succinctly symbolizes the essence of cinema as the little tramp. And even today, the image of the tramp evokes so many ideas about film and film history, and even people who haven't even seen a Charlie Chaplin film recognize him. So we're going to talk a little bit about his early life here and early career. Now, Chaplin is British. He was born in London, and he was the son of a couple of music hall performers. And this early life, this early childhood experience, both on the stage and off the stage, are going to have tremendously powerful effects on not only his personality later, but his life as both a performer in front of the camera, as well as the kinds of films that he would craft behind the camera as a director. He worked, let me back up here just a moment. So like I said, his parents were music hall performers, this vaudeville, and do not be misled. When I talk about these music halls, I'm not talking about highfalutin, high society kind of theater, guys. We're talking regular folks, this vaudeville. And Dad abandoned the family when Chaplin was about 1. His dad died early. He succumbed to alcoholism. Right, so basically was him and his mom and his older half brother Sidney. That's Sidney with a Y, Sydney. And the story is that one night, Mom, who was scheduled to perform on stage that night, her voice was not doing well, so Charlie Chaplin, about 5 years old, he went on stage, his first turn on stage. So it was unhappy circumstances, but there was a rush, and he just, took over. And this really was the beginning of his career. He demonstrated kind of a natural comfortability being on stage. His mom, unfortunately, was having a lot of physical health problems as well as mental health problems, and she eventually had a mental breakdown. And Charlie and his older half-brother, Sidney, they had to fend for themselves. This was a very different kind of culture than we're used to. And they basically were left in the streets. At times, they were part of an orphanage. Sidney was sent to another institution at a time. And the streets of London at the time, if you're familiar with any of this kind of history, or anybody who reads Charles Dickens, that's basically Charlie Chaplin's existence. He's on the street with his older brother Sidney. They're maybe dancing on the street, passing the hat around for pennies. This is by the time he's about 10. So he's familiar with poverty. He's familiar with hunger. He's familiar with madness, with drunkenness, with the cruelty of the poor London streets. He's familiar with the cold impersonality of public institutions. And like I said, this is going to be tremendously influential on his later career and even his own personal life, because he survived. Chaplin survived. He developed his self-reliance. So about 10 years old, he did finally get to work in a clog dance act. He then later got into more comic roles as he became a young man. Here are a couple of pictures of Charlie as a young man. And he gets hooked up with a guy, the term would be an impresario, basically sort of like the chief, the boss of a performing troupe. And this guy's name was Fred Carno. He had a group called the Speechless Comedians. So this is about 1908, and Chaplin gets hooked up with him. And through this, Chaplin learns all about the stage, all about the art of putting on a performance on all ends. So he not only hones his craft as a comedian about performing and movement and blocking. He learns about rehearsing sketches. He learns about preparing scenery and props and training performers. And that was part of what Fred Carno was about. He wanted everybody to learn everything. Now, here's the thing about Chaplin. Very early on, he demonstrated great talent, and he developed different characters. He mostly did comedy. But when you watch Chaplin, you'll notice he knows how to use his body. He knows, let me go back to another picture of him. He knows about pantomime. Pantomime is like when we talk about mimes, they're telling a story silently. They're telling a story through character, developing character through gestures, through movement, through facial expressions. And pantomime is very, very specific. It's very deliberate with the raise of an eyebrow or the turn of the eyes or the wave of a finger in one direction. It's very, very specific, and Chaplin is brilliant with that. Chaplin's also brilliant, as you're going to notice, with mimicry. Mimicry has to do with copying and emulating other types of people, character types, not necessarily like celebrity impressions, but being able to act like certain stereotypical personalities. While he's there with Fred Carno, he does develop a number of characters. One of his most famous at that time that was very popular was a comic drunk character, which people really enjoyed. And like I said, he's also a very gifted dancer. He's almost ballet-like. If you're going to do physical comedy, though, you need to know how to use and move your body. He is acrobatic and almost gymnastic in some ways, but very, very graceful and elegant, as you'll see as well. Sidney Chaplin is his older half brother. He's working with the Carno as well. And incidentally, a little tidbit: Stan Laurel, who would later be a comic partner with Oliver Hardy, it would be Laurel and Hardy. He and Chaplin worked together here at Fred Carno. So if you're familiar with him, there's a connection there. Well, while he's with Fred Carno, it's about 1910-ish, 1912. Carno sends his troupe to America to do a tour, and his comic drunk character is very popular. This comical drunk, because, well, for one thing, everybody gets it. That's a popular type of character. That's something that everybody gets. You don't need any translation about that. And he loves being in America. Chaplin loves being in America. He did have to reluctantly return to England, but he wanted to come back. He wanted to come back to the United States. He knew this was his land of opportunity. By that time, Mom was still dealing with mental issues, but she apparently was doing a little bit better, and she was transferred to a private doctor. So he returns to America, and he gets hooked up with a movie producer named Mack Sennett. Now, Mack Sennett is working in Hollywood, and he connects with Chaplin, and he wants to hire Chaplin. Mack Sennett his company, the Keystone Company, they were making one reel, maybe two reel comedies. And the types of comedies they were doing were what we would call visual slapstick comedy. One of his most prominent characters that Sennett had were there's this group of cops known as the Keystone Cops, named after the Keystone Production Company. Now, if you say Keystone Cops to people today, it generally gives the impression of bumbling idiots, falling all over themselves, being total buffoons. A lot of high action, a lot of visual gags, physical slapstick comedy. So falling down, the slipping on the banana peel, the fast motion chases, the custard pies in the face. All of that kind of stuff is Keystone style comedy, highly visual slapstick comedy, and this was popular. Complex stories, not their goal. Complex characters, not their goal. Highly emotional sympathy, totally not their goal. Chaplin, on one hand, he was kind of reluctant to do this, kind of reluctant to get into movies. He wasn't sure if it was still because, guys, this is still a very new thing. It was a novelty. Chaplin wasn't sure if it was more monkey business than show business. And by the way, Chaplin is very, very hard-headed. He's a stubborn guy. This is why later on he's going to want complete creative control over all his films. On the other hand, because film was new, because the rules were still being written about some things, there was a lot of room for improvisation. And he liked that. That was perfect for Chaplin with all of his ideas. He was allowed to blossom. So he decides to go with Max Sennett. And he finishes out his contract with Carno. And he finally comes to America to start making films. So December of 1913, he joins Keystone. He makes this short film, this one real film called Making a Living, his first one, where he actually plays a villain. And Sennett was not very happy with that. But his next one, in January of 1914, this is the watershed. This is the milestone. Chaplin makes Kid Auto Races at Venice. And this is the very first film that features the Little Tramp. Okay, so he's about 24 years old, and it's at this point he creates the character, the comic character that's going to bring him world fame. Now, the character of the Little Tramp, it seems like it appeared more out of a spontaneous, kind of unpremeditated process. He needed a new comic persona. And so he goes to the wardrobe shack at Keystone Studios, and the story is he basically emerges out with the costume, with the makeup, and the character more or less as we still know it. Chaplin once said that the costume led the way to the character's development from the moment he put it all together. And basically, from the distance between the wardrobe department to the actual set, the Little Tramp was already created. He understood his character. The Kid Auto Races at Venice it's basically Chaplin improvising in front of a group of people who are there to see these races, and he's kind of coming out in the middle and interacting with people and getting in the way of the officials, and that's pretty much what it is. And people loved it. People loved it, and the rest is history. Within months, Sennett I should say Chaplin is Sennett's biggest personality, and he's He soon loved the world over. His box office appeal soared, and of course, when you have that, your price tag bulges. Your price tag goes up. So why was there the appeal of the Little Tramp? Why is there the appeal of the Little Tramp? Well, let's take a look at his character. The Little Tramp has a toughness. The Little Tramp has... okay, so let's take these one at a time. So the toughness is he perseveres in different obstacles. He's not invulnerable. We can't relate to him if he's invulnerable. We can relate to him if he's vulnerable, which he is. But there's a toughness. He can persevere through different obstacles. There is a sense of what we'd call opportunism. In other words, he looks for opportunities to succeed. He takes advantage of them. We see the Little Tramp. He basically says yes to everything. It's, oh, I'll do that. Oh, I'll do that. I'll do that. Taking advantage of different opportunities. And then the last is his dishonesty that helps him to survive. Now, when I say dishonesty, I don't want to paint him as some, low-life criminal. But, well, probably best to go to this next one. When I say dishonest, he often is dishonest for quite ethical reasons. He will break the law. He's not above swiping some food from the cart if he has to. He's not above trespassing, and he's not above fooling the cop. He will break the law, but only if it is to survive or for other noble goals. Noble goals besides survival might be to help others. And we're going to see that he's very, very sacrificial. The Little Tramp is comfortable with doing without and sacrificing his own comfort and freedom to help others with what he believes in. Because he has a kind and generous heart. There is a gentleness to him. The image is easily identifiable. The small brown derby hat, the toothbrush mustache, the over small coat, but the overly large baggy pants, and the big floppy shoes, the bamboo cane. We've got all of these contrasts, big clothes with small clothes, and that's kind of who he is. We can relate to that. We can relate to that. He's a small guy. Chaplin's about 5'5", and we like underdogs, right? We want to see the underdog succeed because we all feel like underdogs. We feel like the world is too big for us, and sometimes it's too oppressive, and sometimes we feel like everything is against us. And we don't have any resources to push through. And that's why we root for him. We like the underdog. Walt Disney, who was a great fan of Chaplin, you definitely see the influence of this kind of character with the early days of Mickey Mouse. Always battling the big guy, the big bully. And that's Chaplin. Chaplin, the Little Tramp, doesn't go looking for trouble. Trouble just seems to find him. And we like and relate to how he gets through it. So that's the Little Tramp. And it got to the point where he was so famous, or at least the Little Tramp was so famous, that movie theaters could just put the image of the Little Tramp out on their marquee and not even have to put a movie title, and people would want to come and see it because it's got Chaplin. It's got the Little Tramp. So for there, right now, I'm going to pause. Other videos will be coming later, and we're going to do this in sections for your benefit as well as mine. So that's the early part of Chaplin's biography and his career, and we're going to continue with that in the next videos. So keep those notes, study them, and we'll talk soon.